When you think about semi-automatic 22s, the Model 66 was ahead of its time, especially in its construction, because at that time, Remington was owned by DuPont.
In the mid-1950s, the Remington Arms Company realized that they needed a competitive semi-automatic 22. And they wanted this gun to be as inexpensive as possible to manufacture. And so the way that they approached this was to make use of some pretty novel manufacturing techniques. Most 22s of this time period are, of course, wood and steel guns, and Remington decided that it would make use of its relationship with DuPont Company, which was, of course, a major chemical conglomerate at the time, and also happened to own Remington Arms at this period. They decided to take advantage of that relationship and use modern materials in the form of polymers.
Eventually, they came up with Zytel 101, and Zytel is still a word that's used in gun stocks and grips and that sort of thing today. But then you ended up with polyamide 66, and then when the fibers were introduced, they changed the name of that family of plastics to nylon, and the material to be used was nylon 66.
Remington builds this 22 semi-automatic rifle with these plastic stocks and names them after Indian, Native American tribes, Seneca, Mohawk, Apache, and they're green, sort of green-brown, brown, black, and markets them through other different companies. And they turn out to be really quite popular. They're lightweight, they can take abuse, and they actually work.
What's unique about the Nylon 66 is when you look at the entire length of the gun, virtually the entire gun from muzzle to heel is one nylon clamshell molding. Now, supposedly the mold that Remington used to make the Nylon 66 was one of the most intricate and expensive polymer molds made up until that point. And this was a huge gamble for Remington at the time because they weren't sure how people would respond to an all-polymer gun. And there were elements of the construction of the Nylon 66 that in some ways were kind of designed to deceive people into thinking that the gun was something that it really wasn't. Over the receiver area of the Nylon 66, there is a stamped sheet metal cover, but there is nothing structural about that design. It is just literally a metal cover. It's got a stamped-in rib along the top that allows you to mount an optic if you want to, but the structural element of the Nylon 66 receiver is polymer.
It turns out they made a heck of a gun, and it was impervious to the elements, fungus, insects, rodents, but also it was accurate and reliable. And so the Nylon 66, the engineering behind it was incredibly solid, not just for the materials, but also the basic design of this blowback-operated semi-automatic.
I remember when I was in college back in the mid-1960s, I worked at a sporting goods store, a sporting goods counter actually at a discount house. And we were just we had some Nylon 66s. And the manager of the sporting goods section, one of his sales pitches when he was trying to peddle a Nylon 66 rifle, he would pick it up by the barrel and smack it as hard as he could on the counter, and then just hand it to the customer, and you could see there was no damage done to the stock whatsoever. And that almost always produced a sale.
In January of 1959, when it was introduced, it retailed for $49.95, which was an affordable price for a rimfire semi-automatic at the time. And Remington really did a lot of legwork before its introduction to make sure that this was something that people would respond well to. And so when Remington introduced this in 1959, it turned out to be a tremendous success. Ultimately, between 1959 and 1991, Remington made more than 1 million nylon 66s. One thing that is interesting and notable is the nylon 66 bridged the gap of that era where you had the advent of the 1968 Gun Control Act. Now, before the 68 GCA, manufacturers weren't actually required to serialize their firearms. And Remington saw that as, an unnecessary added expense to the production of these guns. So the guns that were made from 1959 until 1967 have no serial numbers on them. The guns made after 1967, because Remington anticipated the passage of the 1968 Gun Control Act, which required the serialization of all manufactured firearms, they started stamping serial numbers into the left side of this stamped sheet metal receiver cover.